Welcome to History 111, Lecture 23, Indian Removal. During the early 19th century, white attitudes towards the native population began to change. Early on, they had been paternalistic. The native population was compared to unruly children who needed to grow into responsible adults. They talked about things like the noble savage, but attitudes became increasingly hostile over time, and many believed that it was no longer possible to civilize the savages. They dropped the idea of the nobility and simply referred to them as savages, as people that could not be trusted, could not be civilized, and had no place within American society. So out of this change in attitudes comes a new policy advocated by states in the South and the West, and that policy is called Indian removal. And that policy says that Native Americans within the country's borders should be resettled west of the Mississippi River. And they advocate doing so in what's now Oklahoma, what they call the Indian Territory. And the Indian Territory was at that time believed to be the last inhabitable land before what they call the Great American Desert, which is basically the desert that is Nevada, Utah, and so on. Now, they assumed that in putting these people there, this would push them completely out of the way of white expansion and thus settle the issue permanently. Some of the motives were greed, because at this point, land means wealth. Land is the main form of economic opportunity, and that's really what's fueling this expansionist drive. In addition, racism. The prevailing attitude placed white males at the top of the social order, and therefore, pushing other peoples out of the way wasn't seen as a problem. There's also a history of past conflict where natives have attempted to resist white expansion, and that has led to mutual animosity between both sides. The final factor is a lot of people believed that natives were wasting the land as they saw it, not using it to its full potential. A lot of tribes were still nomadic and had a lifestyle based on hunting. Now, it takes a large amount of land to relative to population to sustain a hunting society, where people are looking to say, hey, I can do a huge amount with it by making it into a plantation. So in other words, they don't respect the way of life that these people have and believe that the way they're using the land is not acceptable because there's profit to be made. And they don't want the Native Americans to make profit, they want to make the profit themselves. Now, where this comes to a head is with the group called the Five Civilized Tribes. It's Cherokee, Creek, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw. Now, they had all adopted agriculture, had very successful economies. The Cherokee had a written constitution, and during the colonial period, they had all adopted European-style societies. Now, these tribal nations were generally new ideas that were primarily created out of a need to unite in the face of European expansion, and they have been very successful in doing so. Now, the legal situation for these groups was that they were domestic dependent nations, is a term the Supreme Court used. And what that meant was only the federal government could negotiate with the tribes who were sovereign nations. Under this theory, the federal government has a duty to help them develop, and they have a similar status to states but are not represented in government. And that's established in part by the Constitution and then by various rulings by the Marshall Court. Now, what they really basically said was the states have no authority over Native American lands, and that's a huge important issue. While initially Indian removal was something that was coming out of certain states, the Supreme Court rulings had made it a federal issue, and in 1830 Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, and the act authorized the federal government to buy land from natives and transport them west of the Mississippi. This was supposed to be voluntary under the act. However, combinations of pressure and less than ethical tactics are used. Now, importantly, a treaty was signed by a small faction of the Cherokee, and the government declared that it applied to all Cherokee. The Cherokee sue and win. The Supreme Court backs them. Jackson, however, refuses to enforce the Supreme Court's decision. Now, despite having the Supreme Court on their side, Andrew Jackson goes forward anyway, and some tribes refuse to leave, and he authorizes the use of the army to evict the natives at gunpoint, and tribes are marched across the country under army escort, and a lot die on the journey, and this becomes known as the Trail of Tears. And once they arrive in the Indian Territory, it's ringed by forts designed to keep them in. Now, this is not universally supported. A lot of Christian missionaries opposed the act. Lincoln, who was not yet a national politician, was very vehemently arguing back in Illinois against it. There's a bitter debate in Congress, and for example, the political career of Davy Crockett comes to a screeching halt. He had fought in the Creek War and felt the only possible consequence of this type of action was widespread slaughter and violence, and he believed that if we went down this course of action, all we would be doing was condemning ourselves to years of warfare and bloodshed. So what's the big idea here? Well, first and foremost, we need to remember this was something that was motivated by greed, racism, and so on, and we should never forget that a lot of people lost their land and many people died as a result of these actions. We also need to understand that this is a key example of the sort of debates about what the new Constitution means in practice. Who has the final say is a question the United States hasn't really settled, and here we have a conflict playing out between Andrew Jackson and the Supreme Court. Ultimately, Andrew Jackson wins that argument because he has the army on his side, and because he can use military force to enforce his will, whereas the Supreme Court cannot. And this issue of who is in charge, or who has the final say, and how those are going to be resolved are things that are going to be really central to American government in the first century. See you in the next lecture.